Here we see our sensor table we created earlier, and we can change the sensor states in there directly, which may be useful a little bit later on as we go along in the tutorial. We're now going to introduce the layout editor. This is used to describe a logical description of all the turnouts and sensors, and eventually we'll add the signals to this. So you get to the layout editor via panels and new panel, and then to the layout editor. This comes up in a window, and because of the size of screen we're showing for this video, we need to do a quick bit of resizing to get it on the middle of the screen. Right, having got the screen to a reasonable size, we're now going to turn on an editing grid, which just makes positioning of items a little bit easier. It's on the options menu. We're also going to turn on the various snap options, which cause things to jump to the grid, which makes things look tidy and well organized. And finally, we're going to zoom things in, just makes it a bit easier to see what we're doing. Now, the first thing we want to do, having positioned ourselves in the top left hand corner, is add a turnout. This is a turnout to the bay. Now, this is where we're going to discover the first little quirk. Things are case sensitive, and if you remember earlier, we defined the turnout with a lowercase b. Oh dear. So what we now need to do is quickly remove that turnout with the remove option, yes, and type it in again, this time with a lowercase b. And this case sensitivity is going to come back and go out now and again until you get used to it, so have a good convention of how things work. We're also going to add the crossover. Now the crossover is a full crossover, so we're going to use the left hand crossover element, position that on the screen, and we're going to drag it around and get the corners of it to align with the snap grid. Just doing a bit of trouble getting hold of it there. Sometimes it's fun doing drags with the panel, with the layout editor. There we go, we're managing to get the various little corner terminations to line up with the grid. Now to draw our track, we're going to need to add some anchor points to connect our track to things. These are little squares which you position on the screen. They just provide you with little places where you can draw track between. They're very important because they're also used to define the edges of pieces of track, which is of course where block boundaries might occur. So we're just positioning some convenient track anchor points along the layout, some coming into the crossover, some near the edge of the baseboard of our demo layout. And finally we're going to have a buffer stop on the bay. A buffer stop is a funny type of track anchor which only has entry on one side. We're now going to add some track segments, and we're going to make them main line track, and we join them pieces of track together. Now you notice as they're joined, first of all the track changes to fax, that's main line, but more importantly the anchor points change to green when they're fully connected. So anchors which are only connected on one side stay red, but anchors which have got connections on both sides are going green. This tells you you've got your anchor points correctly connected to things and not lying around in free space doing nothing. So here we go, doing the bay, and finally we connect to the bay. I'm just going to do the bay not in main line track. You see the bay buffer has gone green as well. I'm just going to change that track style by editing it, and with the drop menu we can change it to ordinary track, and it goes to a thin piece of line. And we can now click on this and the turnouts will be starting to operate. Now what we want to do now is define the blocks. So we'll start by defining the bay. We have to give the block a name, in this case bay. We can reuse names all over the place because a bay turnout is different to a bay block, but please remember things are case sensitive and this will catch us out time and time again. So we quickly check in our sensor table, we use the word bay with a capital B, and we'll hide our sensor table. Type in the sensor that's attached to that piece of track, bay with a capital B, and we'll change the track colour when it's occupied to red. And so we're now done, and we can say done. Now that short piece of track, we're just now defining the piece adjacent to it. As you can see, sensor table, and we're now putting a piece of rolling stock on the track, and the sensor's going active and inactive and changing colour. Unfortunately, we mislabeled that piece with a capital B rather than a lowercase b, as we did lowercase b for the block name, capital B for the block name. Oops. So call it up, edit it again, change that to lowercase b, and now if we occupy the track, you see the entire bay is lighting up red, and yeah, we see it lighting red as we occupy and unoccupy. We'll now start to define the junction block, which is going over the centre of the junction. So the turnout name is called bay, it doesn't really matter. What we're going to do is give the junction block a name. We'll call it junction, this time with capital. I'm going to create the block. We need to add the occupancy sensor, which we previously defined as being junction. We'll change the track colour to red when it's occupied, and we're done. So now if we put something on the turnout, we should see it change state to red. And if we move along the track, this next piece of track is a very short segment linking the two turnouts. It's actually microscopically small when it comes to layout. It's just useful. Join these together. Now the occupied component is the turnout on the short bit of track. And finally we need to define the behaviour of the crossover. Now if you remember earlier, when we created the crossover, we just gave it the name the turnout as crossover, but there are actually two turnouts associated with this crossover, so we're going to use this option here to select the other turnout, and if we click done, now when we operate the crossover it will fire both turnouts. Going back to our editing of blocks, you see the crossover has 4 blocks associated with it. They're arranged clockwise, starting in the top left. So we have one there, then top right, bottom left. These have to be named, and in the same way as when we labelled earlier blocks.